series. It's a joint activity that the Center conducts with the Los Alamos National Laboratory. The co-chair of the series, I'll turn the floor over to him, Dr. Joseph Pilot, who will introduce our speaker and today's topic and the ground rules for today's meeting, which is we'll be operating under Council on Foreign Relations rules of non-attribution. But let me just, before turning the floor over to Joe, just express what a pleasure it is to welcome Scott Sagan back to the Wilson Center. He's spoken here on other occasions, and today's topic is important and timely, and this room, the audience today, reflects the interest in hearing what Scott Sagan thinks about that. So, Joe, over to you.
Thank you, Rob. Let me offer a welcome from the Los Alamos National Laboratory and from me personally. The 2010 Nuclear Posture Review, reflecting the twin objectives of the President's landmark 2009 Prague speech, for the first time placed the U.S. effort to strengthen the international nuclear nonproliferation regime at the center of the U.S. nuclear agenda. This attention underscored the importance of combating nuclear proliferation and terrorism for the United States. As well, it reinforced the view that positively influencing the 2010 NPT Review Conference, which occurred 1 month after the NPR was issued, was a key objective for the Obama administration. In the lead-up to the review conference, it became increasingly clear that the NPR would not be seen only as a statement of U.S. nuclear weapons policy and related issues, but also as an indicator and even a symbol of the administration's commitment to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, especially its Article 6 obligations. There were concerns about whether the NPR could address this type of perception and this expectation, which required it to go well beyond the scope of the Clinton and Bush nuclear posture reviews. In the end, the NPR was seemingly able to address these concerns and played a positive role in the successful outcome of the review conference in New York. The question is, will it affect the behavior of states that are contemplating proliferation? Will it affect international cooperation on non-proliferation? These issues and these questions have been at the heart of the debate about the relationship between nuclear weapons policy and non-proliferation in recent years, and are addressed in a study that is being undertaken by Stanford Center for International Security and Cooperation, or CSAC. It's a multinational study, and we're fortunate to have the director, Professor Scott Sagan, here to offer a preview of the study, which will be released in March. Scott is the Carolyn S.G. Monroe Professor of Political Science, co-director of CSAC, and a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute at Stanford. He also serves as co-chair of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences Global Nuclear Future Initiative. Before joining the Stanford faculty, he was a lecturer in government at Harvard and served in the office of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the Pentagon. He has been a consultant at the Office of the Secretary of Defense, Sandia National Laboratories, and the Los Alamos National Laboratory. He's lectured and published widely. His most recent publications include, quote, Shared Responsibility for Nuclear Disarmament, end quote, in the fall 2009 issue of Daedalus, and The Case for No First Use in the June 2009 issue of Survival. As a study that Scott will be talking about will not be released until March, the preview of its contents and the discussion presented today, as Rob noted, will be under the Council on Foreign Relations Chatham House rule. The results are not to be referenced until the study comes out. If you would like to receive a copy of this study, you can give your card at the end of the meeting to Jane. And if you wish to write about the study or issues relating to it before its release, you'll have to talk to Scott directly to discuss that. With that, Scott, please.
Oh, good. Thank you very much, Joe. It's very nice to come back to the Wilson Center and see some longtime friends and colleagues, and also to meet some new specialists, especially of the younger generation here, which I think is really great. The Obama administration has twice outlined its vision of how its behavior with respect to disarmament and nonproliferation might impact other states. In the Prague speech, President Obama said that he would reduce the role of nuclear weapons in U.S. defense policy and encourage other countries to do the same. And the Nuclear Posture Review, as Joe just noted, explicitly linked U.S. nuclear weapons policy and doctrine to progress on nonproliferation. Quotes, by demonstrating that we take seriously our NPT obligation to pursue nuclear disarmament, we strengthen our ability to mobilize broad international support for the measures needed to reinforce the nonproliferation regime, end of quotes. To what degree has the U.S. government been successful in that effort? How much impact has the Nuclear Posture Review and related activities had? Today, as Joe noted, I'm reporting on the tentative findings of a Stanford CSAC project supported by the Hewlett Foundation, in which a dozen scholars and former policymakers analyzed both the declared reactions and the initial policy responses from over 20 nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. The report, as noted, will be coming out in March. I'm in the unenviable position of summarizing some other people's research before it is in its final stages, so I'll be very appreciative of comments and feedback back, which I can take back to the authors. But I do appreciate you're not quoting. You can quote me on what I say about my own ideas, but I'm reluctant to have you quote especially what other people say. And it's also a interim assessment. That is, this is a midterm report card, so to speak, of this effort, because we're at the midterm period. It's been only 2 years, and understandably, a number of governments are waiting to see what the United States does, not just what the United States says. Fortunately, I don't have the individual case study authors here, but I do have my colleagues Jane Vayman from Harvard and Jane Esberg from Stanford, who will be both taking notes and responding to anything I get wrong in my summaries of other authors, and will answer all of your very tough questions. I'll answer the easy ones. The bottom line of this collective effort is that the 2010 NPR had both positive and some unfortunate results. And the glass of U.S. influence is half full. With respect to other nuclear weapon states, the U.S. effort to encourage other governments to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in their doctrine has been successful in 2 important cases. The government of the United Kingdom adopted a nuclear posture remarkably similar to the U.S. position, and the Russian government adopted a nuclear doctrine that, while not as restrictive as the American doctrine, did not add some new missions for its nuclear forces as they had originally contemplated they were going to do before the Obama administration signaled that it was moving in a different direction. The U.S. Nuclear Posture Review, however, had minimal direct influence with respect to France, China, India, and Pakistan in terms of their nuclear doctrine. I'll be explaining some of those cases. With respect to the non-nuclear weapon states, a similar mixed record of success is apparent. On the positive side of the ledger, the U.S. nuclear policy, including the 2010 NPR, helped produce a positive outcome of at the May 2010 NPT Review Conference, as Joe noted, at which 189 nations agreed on a common set of objectives and positive steps to reinforce the nuclear nonproliferation regime. This is in direct contrast to the 2005 Review Conference, where no final document was produced. In addition, the U.S. policies encouraged at least one state, Indonesia, to start the process of ratifying the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. On the negative side of the ledger, however, Egypt and Brazil, 2 influential non-nuclear weapon states discussed in our case studies, were largely critical of the 2010 NPR and did not significantly alter their previous nonproliferation positions, opposing adding extra strength to the nonproliferation toolbox. That said, however, as I'll be noting in reviewing or reporting on a paper by Harold Mueller on the NPT Review Conference, both Egypt and Brazil, despite those positions, took a very positive role, an important role at the NPT Review Conference, permitting a compromise position to take place in ways that very much met the United States' stated interests. So today I'm going to do three things. One, I'll briefly discuss the standards by which I believe we should judge whether or not the 2010 NPR and related administration activities had influences on other countries' nuclear weapons and nonproliferation policies. Second, I'm going to be walking through the highlights of a number of the author's findings regarding specific reactions of other nuclear weapon states, the NPT Review Conference, and some non-nuclear weapon states. And lastly, I'll conclude with my own insights about some of the lessons learned that I hope can be helpful to U.S. government nonproliferation strategy in general, and in particular for planning future new U.S. nuclear posture reviews. First, what kind of evidence by what standards should we judge whether other countries are influenced by our actions and our statements? And how would you know that in the first place? Well, first, it seems to me one should avoid setting up straw men, which is commonly done in the debate in Washington and elsewhere when critics assume that others think that the United States can influence other nations, especially nuclear weapon states, easily and rapidly based solely on policy pronouncements, that rhetoric will do the trick. Let me give two examples. Harold Brown and John Deutsch, in a 2007 Wall Street Journal op-ed piece called The Nuclear Disarmament Fantasy, maintained that a more progressive U.S. disarmament policy would, quotes, not convince North Korea, Iran, India, Pakistan, or Israel to give up their nuclear weapons programs, and said, again quotes, the declaration that the U.S. will move to eliminate nuclear weapons in the distant future will have no direct effect on changing the calculus of such threats. More recently, in late October here at the Wilson Center, former Bush administration official Chris Ford argued against what he called believers in the credibility thesis. Quotes, it was frequently argued to me in my last government job, and this has been asserted by officials from the Obama administration, that a hearty re-endorsement of nuclear zero as the ultimate goal would do the trick. Would do the trick. That's what you need. This would move fast on disarmament, would get non-proliferation under control. Well, I think Deutsch, Brown, and Ford are setting up and then knocking down straw men. I know no serious policy maker or analyst who thinks that a simple proclamation that the United States government seeks global zero as its goal would either get Iran or North Korea to give up their programs, much less convince other nuclear weapon states to automatically give up theirs. I know no serious policymaker or analyst who believes that a hearty re-endorsement of disarmament will do the trick by itself. Instead, serious analysts, it seems to me, expect that foreign governments will look carefully at both pronouncements of U.S. intent and U.S. actions. They expect such U.S. pronouncements and actions to influence domestic debates inside those foreign governments, and that in some cases, those debates will produce outcomes different than would have occurred had the United States not made those pronouncements and not made those policy changes. Our project's authors provide valuable evidence that in many, but by no means all, as I suggested just earlier, that in many but not all foreign governments, there have indeed been such debates, and some have been strongly affected by Washington's post-Prague disarmament policies and nuclear posture developments. Governments are not mindlessly following what the U.S. says, however, but are also carefully examining what the U.S. does, bargaining with the United States, and sometimes adjusting their nuclear policies in interesting and important ways. So let me first talk about some of the nuclear weapon states. First is Great Britain. The British just last month issued their own Strategic Security and Defense Review, which I read as almost a verbatim restatement of the Obama administration's nuclear posture review with much better prose. The UK government says it's long been clear that we would consider using our nuclear weapons only in extreme circumstances of self-defense. As a responsible nuclear weapons state and party to the NPT, we remain committed to the long-term goal of nuclear weapons disarmament. And then said, quotes, we are now able to give an assurance that the UK, this is following the new nuclear security assurances, saying that the United States would not use nuclear weapons even in the event of being attacked by a non-nuclear weapon state with conventional, chemical, or biological weapons. We would not respond with nuclear weapons, even if, provided that state's a member in good standing in compliance with its NPT review conference, NPT commitments. The British government's nuclear security assurances, negative security assurances, are virtually the same. We can now give the assurance that the UK will not use or threaten to use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states parties to the NPT. In giving this assurance, we emphasize the need for universal adherence to and compliance with the NPT, and note that this assurance would not apply to any state in material breach of those non-proliferation obligations. We also note, adding what was a marker to the U.S. policy, the NPR said that if biological weapons are further developed in much more dangerous ways in the future, we might revisit these reassurances. That, in my judgment, was not a caveat, but rather a marker of future changes, that we may change our assurances in the future, but not that we're going to willy-nilly give up that assurance under current circumstances. And the British government actually even stated it more clearly than the U.S. NPR did. We know that while there's no direct threat to the UK or its vital interest from states developing capabilities in other weapons of mass destruction, for example, chemical and biological, we reserve the right to review this assurance if the future threat, development, and proliferation of these weapons make it necessary. So this is the first case of a state very much being influenced by us. More controversially, and I think even more importantly, Pavel Podvig writes a superb essay in this study, providing evidence of a second case, Russia, in which a nuclear weapon state has been positively influenced by the Obama nuclear initiative. Now, Podvig is very clear. He's not arguing that the NPR by itself led to these changes. Clearly, the decisions about missile defense, the New START, a variety of other activities create a dynamic in Russian foreign policy and nuclear weapons policy, and the NPR is one, but only one part of it. But what Podvig compellingly demonstrates in this draft manuscript is that the final version of the Russian nuclear doctrine, which was released in February 2010, which outlined a modestly reduced role for nuclear weapons in Russia, was a significant shift from what they were about to do in 2008 and 2009. He outlines a series of Russian statements and then supplemented these with interviews of both Russian civilian and military leaders, showing that in 2009 they were leaning towards adopting a flexible nuclear doctrine which would include a much wider range of potential uses of nuclear weapons, including a preventive nuclear strike on any aggressor, that is, a potential use of nuclear weapons against a state that was proliferating, and the use of nuclear weapons, quotes, to repel an aggression from the use of conventional weapons, not only in large-scale conflicts, but in regional or even in local wars. While the final 2010 nuclear posture in Russia did maintain that nuclear other WMD aggression would justify a nuclear reprisal, that is, it didn't go as far as we did with respect to calculated ambiguity or negative security assurances. It nonetheless did not mention preventive strikes. They took that out and did not include comments about regional or even local war, but instead, quotes, said they would respond only to attacks that were, quotes, imperiling the very existence of the state. So movement in the other direction. And what Podvig argues was that the Prague speech, the missile defense decisions, and the NPR and the information about what it might contain helped in Moscow by creating a set of new empowered officials, he argues, at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that were both more eager and more capable of promoting a more restrained Russian doctrine than their predecessors had been. So you have, in this case, a domestic bureaucratic argument that our position changed the debate there and empowered positions differently than existed previously. Third, a more mixed case, China. Tom Finger, former head of the National Intelligence Council, now a senior scholar at Stanford, will be publishing in March the final version of a paper outlining in great detail the Chinese reactions to the U.S. Nuclear Posture Review and related statements. A couple interesting points about Tom Finger's essay. Well, first, there's much more diversity in Chinese positions than there ever was in the past. Not only are we able to see more of them, but you can see some Chinese officials leaning in one direction, others leaning in the other. Some going as far as to call the push for nuclear disarmament and nonproliferation, quotes, a means to preserve American hegemony and justify military intervention. And others saying, no, this is movement to honor Article 6 commitments and a positive step. Finger convincingly argues that the responses are not just a function of the NPR, but rather must be seen in the context of current U.S.-Chinese relations, with a number of statements being made, he believes, because of the low point in U.S.-China relations last year and relates to the NPR coming out around the same time as U.S. arms sales to Taiwan. Now, he also notes one very positive and one very alarmist view in the majority of positions taken in the Chinese discourse on the NPR. On the positive side, the Chinese commentators are very commonly note the contrast between the position that they were placed, that their government, the Chinese government, was placed in 2001 when the Bush administration issued its NPR and it got leaked, in which China was mentioned along with Iraq, Iran, Syria, Libya, and North Korea as a state in which the United States may have a military crisis with, and therefore in which our active uses of nuclear weapons need to be contemplated for deterrent purposes. In 2010, instead of listing China among the rogue states, China is listed as a state that has potential nuclear ambitions that concerns the United States, but that should be a partner in stability and transparency talks. China is mentioned in the contrast to 2001, is mentioned as a target of potential discussions along with the Russians. And putting the Chinese government in the camp of the Russians is seen in the Chinese literature and interviews that Finger took for this project as being a very important, positive, and appreciated change. At the same time, however, he notes that, again, there's a common theme that the Chinese government, while believing it would benefit and would welcome discussions about strategic stability, notes that, from their perspective, the two items that are most worrisome for strategic stability, that is missile defense and conventional global strike capabilities, are explicitly protected in the Nuclear Posture Review, with signals saying that this is something that we're moving forward with and is not something that the United States government considers part of its reducing the role of nuclear weapons is a positive thing. Those two programs are part of reducing the role of nuclear weapons. And from the Chinese perspective, they say that's part of the stability problem that we see is the way you're going about this. So Finger concludes that it's a mixed result, but one that opens up the opportunity for discussions about stability, but that the Chinese are reacting with very mixed views on the U.S. NPR. Nonetheless, they actually don't stand in the way of any progress at the NPT review conference, and Tom is optimistic that at least we can begin a dialogue in this area. The last nuclear weapon state I want to mention briefly is India. Paul Kapoor from the Naval Postgraduate School has his forthcoming piece entitled More Posture Than Review, Indian Perspectives on the U.S. NPR, in which he cites repeatedly scathing analyses from Indian scholars, former officials, and officials that he is interviewing in not-for-attribution discussions, arguing that the United States is not adopting a no-first-use policy when India did. The NPR, if you recall, said that having the sole use of nuclear weapons to deter other nuclear weapons should be our long-term goal, but we're not quite there yet. We're not capable to do that. Added a note saying the fundamental role of nuclear weapons is to deter other states' nuclear weapons, but not saying that is the sole goal. And repeatedly, Indian commentators criticized the United States for not going to India's level of no first use. I find this utterly perplexing because India no longer has a no first use policy. They themselves, in 2003, published their nuclear posture, their nuclear doctrine statement, in which they said both that we have a no first use policy and always had a no first use policy, and if another country uses chemical or biological weapons against us, we hold open the right to use nuclear weapons. Almost a verbatim quote from our 2001 NPR, and then added a uniquely, I guess this still is a no first use statement, but hardly a defensive no first use statement, saying that if Indian troops are attacked with a single nuclear weapon anywhere where they might be, even in foreign territories, they would respond with a full retaliatory blow, which is an effort to say that if they launch a conventional attack against Pakistan, Pakistan uses a nuclear weapon inside Pakistani soil to stop the conventional attack, that India would respond with a full retaliatory blow. And what was striking, I think, in the analysis that Kapoor has produced in terms of commentary is how little awareness of Indian doctrine the Indian commentators had. That is, there was very little comparison directly to our doctrine, but instead they repeated two mantras. One is that we have a no first use doctrine and you don't. Not quite true. And second, that when you get down to our numbers, then we can talk about disarmament. That's a repeated line. Paul's piece was finished in October prior to the latest summit. And the real question coming out of the summit, there are many questions, but one of them is what will happen on the Indians' own nuclear doctrine. Will they move gradually towards their earlier, more pristine or less caveated no first use doctrine? Will they adopt a similar negative security assurances as we did? Or will they keep maintaining their current mantra? I was pleased to note that at the Obama-Singh summit, the final statement said, quotes, the two leaders affirmed that their country's common ideals, complementary strength, and shared commitments to a world without nuclear weapons gives them a responsibility to forge a strong partnership to lead global efforts for non-proliferation and universal and non-discriminatory global nuclear disarmament in the 21st century. They affirm the need for a more meaningful dialogue among all states possessing nuclear weapons and for reducing the salience of nuclear weapons in international affairs and security doctrines. So I find this to be a particularly interesting potential development. Lastly, let me say something about the non-nuclear weapon states and the proposals that were in, or the reports that were in this manuscript. First is, I think, one of the best chapters in this special issue, which will appear in March as a special issue of the Non-Proliferation Review, published by the Monterey Institute, the James Martin Center. One of the most fascinating studies is by Harold Mueller from the Frankfurt Peace Research Institute and a delegate on the German delegation to the NPT Review Conference, both in 2005 and in 2010. And he presents a very detailed analysis of the inner workings of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference and makes a compelling case, he argues, for Egypt and Brazil being the key players leading to the success of the 2010 RevCon, but also arguing that they could not have done what they did without the Obama policies permitting them some space and giving them something that they wanted so that they could take this role in the non-aligned movement. He argues, in short, in more political science terms, that it was that the 2010 NPR and related activities were a necessary but not sufficient condition. We still had to give them something, but could not have been able to be successful without the non-proliferation and disarmament action. Mueller's very insightful analysis of Egypt argues that the Egyptians were engaged in what he calls a virtuous double game. They were both the head of the non-aligned movement and the head of the New Agenda Coalition, two coalitions at the NPT RevCon. And they could not, he argues, I'm quoting here from the draft, Egypt would probably not have been able to take the bulk of the non-aligned movement to the compromise road, with Syria and Cuba following grudgingly and Iran being pressured into acquiescence, without the clear expectations that there were things that the United States was doing with respect to disarmament and the negative security assurances. The most impressive moment, he argues, was when Iran, in the third week of the NPT Review Conference, tried to put the brakes on the entire meeting. Argued on procedural grounds that there were some problems, tried to get a demand put in that was supported by Cuba and Syria that deleted positive language about the Washington Nuclear Summit and the Iranian allegation that the new American doctrine was even more threatening to non-nuclear weapon states than was the previous one. That is, negative assurances by being attached to NPT compliance, they argued was actually much worse than anything in the past, which from their perspective, given what they're being accused of, they tried to get that into the NPT RevCon, and Egypt saw to it that this radical demand did not find its way into the NAM document, and the Egyptians and Brazilians apparently had a direct approach to Tehran to overcome the Iranian government's last-minute resistance to adapting the final document, he reports. So, with respect to Egypt and Brazil, you still don't have major changes in their position that they are not ready to have some of the tools that the United States would like to see added to the non-proliferation toolkit, to have the additional protocol be a mandatory requirement for states to get new nuclear technology, or to have some changes made in interpretations of Article 10 of the NPT to make it harder for states to withdraw by demanding that they have to return materials or technologies if they withdraw from the NPT. Egypt and Brazil are not there. But they saw what the United States was doing as giving them enough, especially if you add to it the 2012, the negotiations to have a Middle East nuclear weapons free zone conference for the Egyptians. That coupled together gave them enough that they pushed to make sure that this conference was a success against some of the hardliners who otherwise would have ensured that it would have failed. Lastly, two other very brief comments. One on Japan. Ralph Costa and Brad Glusman have a very interesting chapter forthcoming talking about how the Japanese government deeply appreciated the level of consultation that occurred in the U.S. NPR, unprecedented in its depth and continuity. There's a long-standing set of discussions. Now, it is true that the Japanese government not just changed its positions, but they changed their government during this process. So initially, there were lots of concerns on the Japanese official level, briefed to the Perry-Schlesinger Commission and to many others, that specific weapon systems were crucial for extended deterrence in their perspective. In particular, the TLAM-N, the Tomahawk Land Attack nuclear missile, which the United States wanted to retire, was considered to be crucial. When the Japanese government changed, they no longer felt that that was essential. And indeed, as Brad and Ralph point out, the Foreign Ministry went so far as to write to the U.S. State Department saying that you should know that our previous position is not this government's position, and that we would not believe that our extended deterrent guarantee from you is dependent upon any one particular system. So the NPR found it much easier then to accept the retirement of the TLAM-N and to call that you should have extended deterrence still as an important concept, but that you could use long-range systems or deploy into the region nuclear weapons in a crisis if absolutely necessary and supported by Tokyo and Seoul. I would note just one extra personal point here is I think it's very helpful that Japan is beginning to debate these issues in a more detailed and healthy manner. I had 2 trips there last year and still find that some Japanese scholars and policymakers still talk in excessively vague terms. They'll talk about the nuclear umbrella and the need for the nuclear umbrella. This came out in the Prime Minister's response on Hiroshima Day this past year. And I think it's really unfortunate. Indeed, I think the term nuclear umbrella should be banned from our strategic lexicon. Not only does it denote some kind of defensive shield, so the imagery is misleading instead of a big stick that we might use to retaliate, but it doesn't, as we should always, differentiate between using nuclear weapons to deter chemical, biological, or conventional attacks versus having them to deter nuclear weapons attacks on us or our neighbors. An extended nuclear guarantee could mean there are different kinds of extended nuclear guarantees, and the Japanese dialogue is beginning to address these kinds of concepts, and you see in Kosser and Glosserman's paper beginnings of joint efforts to rethink in a collaborative manner what the future of extended deterrence would be. One last point, and then I'll go to the lessons. The last case is more minor, but nonetheless it's actually a wonderful example of progress in yet another non-nuclear weapon states. Indonesia specifically shifted its policy on the comprehensive test ban in May 2010, and that can be interpreted in light of bargaining dynamics and what the United States did in the Nuclear Posture Review. Indonesia has consistently supported the CTB since signing it in 1996, but held off ratification. The Bush administration's hostility to the treaty made statements of Indonesians supporting the treaty common, but they refused to ratify on grounds that they did not want to benefit this effort when the United States was going in the opposite direction. But following President Obama's statement in Prague that he would move immediately and aggressively to pursue ratification of the CTBT, India began to talk about their ratification, coming immediately after the United States does so. At the May 2010 NPT Review Conference, Indonesia switched to positive encouragement by saying that it would ratify first. As the head of the in a statement to the UN, the Indonesian foreign minister said, "We are cognizant of some positive aspects of the U.S. nuclear posture review," and wanted to move forward to support movement in that direction. So what lessons do I get from all of this mixed set of activities? Well, first, we have to pay equal attention to our rhetoric and our reality. The NPR is a signaling device, as Joe immediately said, to a number of states around the world, but it's also a signaling device to the U.S. Congress and the U.S. Senate in particular about what our policies would be. Simply expecting that the United States can live on its rhetoric is not sufficient, even for those like myself who thinks that rhetoric is important. We have to move forward. It's far too soon to pat the United States on the back and say others will follow this agenda. Clearly, progress will be hard, especially hard, as everybody in this town knows, given the developments this week with respect to New START. But progress, not just rhetoric, is what people are paying attention to in these states. Second lesson I get from this is that it is important to have successes at the NPT RevCon, but that we shouldn't expect even when there are successes, for all the tools that we would like to be placed into the non-proliferation toolkit, for them all to be adopted by non-nuclear weapon states who view these activities as impositions against their sovereignty. Article 4 of the NPT does state that all members have that nothing in the treaty impedes the inalienable right to benefit from nuclear power. And there's nothing that says that right excludes uranium enrichment or plutonium reprocessing. Those countries who are interested in that, and even those ones who are really not that interested in it, in most cases are deeply reluctant to give up what they consider a right, even if they don't want to exercise it. So I come away from this saying it is very positive to have steps endorsed through the review conference encouraging the additional protocol, encouraging Article 6 and Article 4, but that we're going to need the Nuclear Suppliers Group or other groups, not the NPT, to be the main stage where action in terms of export controls, of having things like return to sender clauses or improved safeguards placed on what are called Type 66 safeguards in the IAE language, to have those put in place as requirements for new nuclear technology transfers, I think has to be done at the NSG, not through the NPT review conference, despite these positive steps. And lastly, quite clearly, we need to take pretty seriously some kind of movement. I don't know how it's going to work. Many here in this room may know more about this than I do, but the progress or lack thereof thus far, movement towards the 2012 Middle East Nuclear Weapons Free Zone Conference. But if we don't want to have a car wreck at the 2005 review conference, we need to keep in mind that last time we made promises and were not able to fulfill them. It created a huge NPT RevCon problem, and we should try to avoid that if possible. Three last points. The NPT review conference the NPR of 2010 shows how important consultations are. This strikes me as, regardless of whether you do a public or a private NPR, there'll always be some kind of public statement about it. And there have been some, but very limited, consultations in the past compared to what happened this time. And even in states that did not like all of the results of the NPR of 2010, the case study reporters constantly went back to, even the ones that they had some disagreements, they really appreciated being consulted about it ahead of time, felt that they were heard, whether or not they were always listened to it with respect to the final outcome. And that suggests, not just in the case of the TLAM-N that I mentioned earlier, but that future dialogues at a high level and lower level consultations would prove valuable. Fourth and fifth are some problems. The one refrain in many of the states that are focused upon in our study is a disagreement with the United States about the importance of nuclear terrorism. The Nuclear Posture Review elevated not just nonproliferation to being a major goal on par with deterrence of the U.S. posture, but also preventing nuclear terrorism. And many of our case studies, a Nabil Fahmy study of Egypt, Kosa's and Glosserman's on Japan, Mustafa Kirabugalu's study of Turkey, all quite directly quote officials stating that they disagree with America's placing such a high priority on nuclear terrorism. Think that they're concerned about state issues and think that we're exaggerating the danger. Now, that became an issue in the NPT review conference where the positive references even to the Nuclear Security Summit became an issue of debate. And again, Egypt and Brazil were able to get that put in as a positive reference despite some countries not wanting to make such statements. And why is that? I think there's both a stated reason and an unstated reason. This is my own judgment, not those of my colleagues. And I think there are many of government officials and scholars and ex-policymakers in some countries who publicly will say, well, we just disagree with the estimates, but privately feel, and privately sometimes will say, that if there's a terrorist attack, it's going to be against you. It's not going to be against us. It's going to be against you because of your foreign policies. So why should we be spending a lot of money to do things that are protecting you when it's your fault that you've got this problem of terrorism in the world? Now, that's a very stark way of putting it, and no one will say that quite as directly openly, but in lots of meetings, statements of that sort privately get made. And there are two ways I think we need to combat that. One is to say, well, no, actually, there have been terrorist attacks on facilities elsewhere, not just in the United States, and terrorists have been interested in using materials for dirty bombs, potentially for weapons, against countries other than the United States. Moreover, even if attack of materials or weapons stolen elsewhere were used against the United States and or against Western Europe, what Kofi Annan called the second wave of terrorist effects will affect everybody. The economic consequences of a major terrorist attack would be not just felt in the state of victimization, but would be global. Lastly, I think it's very positive that the Nuclear Security Summit was not a one-time affair. Indeed, I think the real brilliance of the Security Summit was to make sure that heads of state agreed to check in again in 2012, to have someone else lead it, the South Koreans this time. And no head of state wants to show up at that meeting, already scheduled, without having something to show for 2 years' worth of work. So just as nuclear safety was elevated to be a CEO issue in nuclear industries around the world after 3 Mile Island, nuclear security has been elevated to be a president's or prime minister's level of attention through the Nuclear summit. So I think that's a very positive thing. But it was interesting nonetheless how many people still disagreed with it. And lastly, I'll conclude with one last comment. As my colleagues looked at their governments, most reviewing the NPR understood it correctly as a statement of broad posture, but also understood that there were some aspects of it that were somewhat ambiguous or subject to interpretation, and that they are waiting to see what happens in the coming years, not just on the arms control, New START front, et cetera, but also on whether the U.S. direct guidance given to the military and the labs is consistent fully with the NPR. Now, those are classified documents. Many people here may be working on those, as I did in an earlier part of my career. But nonetheless, I do have a concern that the U.S. government has to make sure that it enforces more discipline in our discussions about nuclear guidance and more consistency between statements that are made and what our posture is. And here I would just note that I've been very concerned with statements coming out of the Strategic Command. General Chilton said prior to the NPR last year, 2009, that the United States might use nuclear weapons in response to a cyber attack. I think you don't take any response options off the table from an attack on the United States. Why should we constrain ourselves in how we should respond? And more recently, General Chilton insisted that the United States had not altered its calculated ambiguity policy, despite the statements in the 2010 NPR saying that we unequivocally would not use nuclear weapons against a state, provided they are in compliance with their NPT commitments. So I conclude that countries pay a lot of attention, not just to what official documents say, but what implementers say about their interpretations of them. And if we want the Nuclear Posture Review to have a greater impact on people's perceptions, we should be more consistent in what we say about it. I'll conclude there. I'm really looking forward to comments and questions, as Joe and Rob have suggested, since these papers are still in their final penultimate draft version, specific comments on individual points. I can get back to the authors, and you can be helpful in that regard.
We have a rich menu. Questions or comments? Yes.
Can everyone identify? I know some,
Yeah,
but by no means all of you.
The microphone will
That would be
circulate,
very
and
helpful.
speakers, please do identify yourself.
Wait for the microphone, please. It's coming.
Hi, I'm Harry Heinzelman from the State Department. I just want to get our negative security assurance right.
Okay.
It's not compliance with your NPT obligations, it's your non-proliferation obligations.
And can you explain your view on what that difference?
That would
significance of
encompass
the
your
difference?
safeguards obligations too,
Okay.
because those are derived from a different source than the NPT. You could trace your way back there, but I think the intent was to make it clear that it was just not your Article 1 or Article 2 obligations, but your safeguards obligations.
Okay, I understand that. Now, would you agree with this comments, this differentiation that I was making between a caveat and a marker? That is, the statement in the NPR that says if future developments in biological weapons developed, we would review our our current assurances, which occasionally, especially in the Indian paper, they said, oh, that means that the president could use nuclear weapons at any time, which I don't see that. I see that as saying we'd have to change our policy first, and then we'd reconsider under these circumstances. Is that correct? Is that a caveat, or is it a marker of future potential changes?
Well, Scott, I guess my answer would be you worked in government. This document was derived and reviewed at very high levels, and the language was put together by a committee. So to try to identify precise, I think your interpretation is correct, but as to whether anybody affirmatively thought about this or came up with a decision on it, I would defer on that point, because any answer I gave you would probably be wrong.
That's very helpful.
Yes. Questions? Yes. Right there.
Michael Binder, Air Force Declassification Office. In an open session, former Air Force Secretary Thomas Reed said that the North Korean nuclear device was based on a Chinese design. I was wondering how well China is adhering to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Was that something that was given to North Korea many, many years ago, or is that something more recent?
All I know is that there are widespread beliefs, both on the North Korean side, but especially on the Pakistani side, that the designs came out of China. Reed, I don't recall whether he, in the book with Danny Stillman, has any documents that he cites on that. I think the general view in the Non-Proliferation community writ large was that China for a long period of time was not a member of the NPT. Once it joined, it stopped some of its worst proliferation activities, but that it took quite a long time for them either to control their own bureaucracy well enough, or the other interpretation is that they still had some things they wanted to do and continued doing those things under the cover of we're still dealing with export controls. So that's a general answer, but I don't have a specific on the design question. Maybe others here do have more knowledge on the design or can say so.
Yes, right here.
Victor Stone, I'd like you to address, if you would, your very last comment in your opening, when you think that an individual who's a U.S. government official says something which is out of line with what the policy is. What do you think needs to happen so that the other signers and nations will recognize that we are still in line? Is it enough just to, well, who would disavow that person's statement? Does he have to withdraw it? Or is there even more significant that action that has to be taken so that they accept that we're not just pushing it under the rug?
Right. It's hard to know in each individual case whether a statement that is in tension with or even in contradiction to a U.S. government policy, when an individual makes it, whether it's an inadvertent or a deliberate action, because people will push the envelope quite clearly. So the first thing I think you need to do is find that out. And second, the degree to which somebody should be forced to be corrected versus being reprimanded would depend in part on your judgment on whether this is a deliberate or an inadvertent statement contradicting U.S. government policy. So that's as far as I could go as a general principle. I think you'd have to handle each case, but I would use that as the criteria.
Well, how about opining that a cyber attack would warrant nuclear retaliation? Right. As an example.
When it's given twice, it's usually not inadvertent. You gave the example of being said twice, so that's why
I think the senior officials above General Chilton should have said it is not the United States position that we are going to use nuclear weapons if someone uses cyber attacks. We have other means of responding, and we are working very hard to ensure identification of where cyber attacks would come from, and let it stand at that. I think we have had, over a long period of time, we've gotten into a very bad habit in the United States of thinking that it is costless to talk about using nuclear weapons in a variety of contingencies. So we have the interesting and curious case in the 2009 campaign when then Senator Obama says something that was a pretty hard position at the time, that if if he's elected, and we have Al-Qaeda cells found in Pakistan, the Pakistanis aren't willing to go after them. He declared in one of the campaign debates that I'd attack them, regardless of what the Pakistani military said. And when asked, well, how would you do that? He said, well, I'd use drones or something. I wouldn't use nuclear weapons. And then Senator Clinton, then Senator Clinton, attacked Obama for being irresponsible and not knowing that you should never say when you won't use nuclear weapons. You're weakening deterrence. That's just an example of just a bad habit that we've gotten into in the United States. The likelihood we would use nuclear weapons against Pakistan, against Al-Qaeda, is so minimal that I think it reduces our credibility of real scenarios when we make statements like that. B, this was utterly unhelpful with the Pakistani military, who is willing to look the other way if you use drone attacks, but does not like officials saying that you might use nuclear weapons. And C, did not help with our efforts around the world saying that we're reducing the role of nuclear weapons in the future. A Pakistani general with whom I've had interactions over there a long time once said after that, he said, can you explain what's going on here? Like, two people on the more liberal side of your political spectrum, one says he wants to attack us, the other one says she wants to nuke us? And
a more interesting case would be, and here I wouldn't have put it to a vote in the whole country, is like use of a nuclear weapon at Tora Bora, where you probably would have gotten a lot of people saying, go ahead. But I wouldn't have gone. I wouldn't have gone on public on the whims of public opinion. You remember, 22% of the American public thought Truman was wrong in 1945 to have used only 2 nuclear weapons, and that we should have used more nuclear weapons before giving Japan a chance to surrender. So I wouldn't go on with public opinion on those kinds of things. I'm with you. I'm just saying, I think attitudes after 9/11, were pretty raw.
Yeah, that's fair.
Got Amy over there.
Okay, let's go to our next question. Roger.
I wonder whether you could say more about Brazil's response to the review. Has been more to it than just the insistence on the inalienable right. I recall that 50 years ago at the ENDC, Brazil made a big issue about the right to conduct peaceful explosions for great engineering works, as one of the representatives put it. And since then, it has not conducted any explosions, peaceful or otherwise. 50 years ago, it was a right-wing military regime. Now it is a left-wing democracy. Has anything changed, really?
Yes, I think it has. One big thing that changed is that they signed and ratified the NPT. So the NPT, as a non-nuclear weapon state, you are not able, you can benefit from the explorations of P&Es in nuclear states, but you cannot conduct a peaceful nuclear explosive on your own territory. So that was a potential loophole for countries that were not members of the NPT to say we're moving on progress to develop nuclear explosive technology that could be helpful for military purposes, but we should not be punished. We should not have international opprobrium because they're peaceful purposes. So that's at least a portion of the story in 1974 in India. And I think the Brazilians, prior to ratifying the NPT, wanted to keep open that loophole for themselves. So now they can't. Now they are no longer able to do that, but I think they still resent efforts to try to have the additional protocol. And whether they're bargaining for something or something more important, I don't know. Jane, do you want to add anything on the Brazilian chapter? Because you've just read the latest draft of it. I don't know if you want to add anything, or is that sufficient?
Well, I think one of the interesting points on Brazil now is that they're still sort of pushing the boundaries of the non-proliferation regime. Right? The vice president recently made a comment about how Brazil wanted to keep open the option of getting nuclear weapons in the future, and now they're pushing on to develop a nuclear submarine, actually, which would present an interesting challenge to the nonproliferation regime because it would probably require highly enriched uranium. So I think that Brazil is still a very interesting case, and I don't necessarily think that they're sort of the model NPT citizen that they try to make themselves appear to be. But I also I think that they've come a long way since the military regime, particularly domestically, because nuclear weapons have become sort of a symbol of the military regime in many ways.
So this chapter is being written by Irma Aguelo from Argentina, and still in draft form. I'll make sure to get a copy of it to you when it finally comes out in March.
Yes, right here.
And then Amy has a question. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Sean Dunlop. I'm a non-proliferation fellow with the Department of Energy. You talked a little bit about how Japan has sort of evolved its thinking on extended deterrence. I was wondering if you found anything on how NATO states view it, particularly Turkey.
Well, NATO states obviously have many different views, and Harold Mueller doing double duty as a chapter in this study, looking at broadly at NATO, and Mustafa Kibaroglu has the one on Turkey specifically. I would just say 2 points about Mustafa's view in particular. Again, it's difficult for me to summarize in these detailed studies because I'm not a specialist on Turkey. But his views on two things are, I think, worth citing, and I'll send you the final draft, Sean. First off, he thinks that concerns in the United States that Turkey's going to develop nuclear weapons because of Iran, and the only thing that stops them are a handful of tactical weapons at Incirlink. He thinks those are really exaggerated. That while the Turkish government still wants to have a symbol of U.S. commitments on its soil, is not like the German government, does want to keep the weapons there. He thinks that the consequences of removing them would be a lot less disastrous than some Americans do who are concerned about that. And he cites as an example, which is, I think, an interesting one, the Jupiter missile withdrawal in '63, saying that there were similar concerns back then, and that you dealt with them by saying that we have submarines whose missiles cover the same targets as the Jupiters did. Indeed, we even had a Polaris come into a Turkish port and had Turkish politicians go on board and pat the missiles.
Scott, just a two-finger that why, I mean, it's interesting, this paper says that an Iranian weapon would lead Turkey to reevaluate its non-proliferation, its nuclear intentions.
No, he says that Americans often say that.
Okay.
And he said he does not think that's the case.
He doesn't think it, okay. Because that's consistent with, like, Turkey not going along with sanctions in the UN on Iran to try to affect it. So, okay.
Yeah,
so the cascade kind of thesis on Turkey doesn't hold up in the event of Iran.
That is what he argues. And he said that they still want to keep the weapons there, but he said his belief is that it would be far less disastrous, citing that as an example, and then citing, and clearly Turkey is in this unusual position between East and West. But he said the Turks have not given up on joining Europe. For the Turks to move forward on a nuclear weapons program would guarantee that effort is forever damaged. So he said that if you think broadly about this, I understand the logic of deterrence and what Americans get worried about, but he said he thinks that our concerns are exaggerated, and then explains it on these kinds of grounds. Yes.
Amy?
I want to go back to the General Chilton comments for a moment, both to clarify and then to lead up to a question. I think his first comment about cyber warfare was not only prior to the NPR, but prior to this administration, and actually is better linked to the comment you all elicited out at Stanford from Steve Hadley about nuking people who finance terrorists, the Hadley corollary. there was a drift prior to this administration. People thought we were threatening everybody and everything with nuclear weapons, and that drift stopped with the NPR. But the second Chilton statement I would attribute to something a little differently, which would lead me to my question. There's a huge disconnect between the people who make declaratory policy in the State Department and people who make nuclear policy in the Pentagon, and they often don't know what the other ones are talking about. And one would argue that Chilton should have been aware of the policy because the NPR was just concluded, but quite often operationally in declaratory policy it doesn't match up, and the people reviewing his speech probably weren't even aware of it. So that leads me to my question that we have a lot of this bureaucratic divide and a lot of voices talking about policy and not always using the same words to describe the same policy. We know that's true. Do the other countries listening to our expressions of policy understand that quite often it's not a change in policy, just the wrong speaker getting the words mixed up?
No. Yeah, please.
Amy, one of the working group chairs was from Stratcom. Stratcom was intimately involved in the NPR. So they were engaged in the decisions that were made on negative security assurances.
But the fact is, we will always have these statements that differ from different people, and is there any way to make that not be an international incident?
Well, I think there's a very common tendency that we all have to understand our own government's divisions and tensions, and to recognize that a Stratcom statement may not be entirely coordinated with a State Department statement or something said by a senator, even of the party of the government may not in power, may not be fully reflective of what the president says. But how often, right after when you have that analysis of ourselves, do we say Russia believes X, or the Japanese think that Y? And one thing we tried to do in our papers was constantly remind the authors, show the diversity of opinions, show that in their countries that you're studying, or in some cases that you're from, but in other cases Americans going there and interviewing people, that there's a diversity of opinion and that they have bureaucratic politics and they have divisions of responsibilities and they have people pushing back in their countries as well. That said, we found repeated examples of people taking, in other governments or other countries, taking statements that were not reflective of the view of the United States and saying that they were the views of the United States. So it's a common phenomenon of not understanding the complexity of other governments, even if we understand them by ourselves.
The corner.
And I'll check on the date of the Chilton. I'll check on the day of the Chilton comment, Amy, to see exactly what it was in the context.
A question here. Could you elaborate a little bit more on the statement that you made regarding attitude of certain countries with respect to nuclear terrorism? And my question is, your interpretation of what they're saying, is that kind of posturing, conviction, or denial? And I ask that because I'm going to make a very bad analogy. It's not a good analogy, but if you look at the conventional terrorism and you add up the numbers, 90% of the folks, at least for certain terrorist groups, have been co-religionists who have been the victims. So do they take that into account and make those statements regarding nuclear terrorism?
No, I don't think they take that into account, and I think what they feel, I see this from going to meetings at various places around the world where nuclear terrorism issues are addressed, and it's often the United States which is giving the threat briefing, in effect. And people will often say, well, I understand that, your concerns, but you're part of the problem. is that posturing on their side or denial? Probably a bit of both. It may differ from different countries, but I think you're right that the concerns in other countries should be that they're the subject of conventional, or the victim of conventional capabilities, and it's by no means clear that it would be the United States would be the victim. The threat of nuclear weapons falling in the hands of terrorists is not a new problem. Bin Laden's not by any means the first head of a terrorist organization who has advocated using nuclear weapons. We had the Baader-Meinhof gang trying to seize a nuclear weapon in Europe in the 70s. You had the Aum Shinrikyo thinking that their use of a nuclear weapon, they had pretty wild schemes to try to develop their own, buying uranium in Australia. I mean, some of this was really far-fetched, but they then did turn to, can we penetrate the Russian military and use some of our cult members to try to get access to a Russian weapon. They weren't necessarily going to use them against the United States. They wanted to use it in Japan, where they're going to create a Holocaust that would eventually lead to a war, and their true believers would survive. So I think the nuclear terrorism problem is a global one, not limited to Islamic fundamentalists, and certainly not limited to the United States. Yes.
Yes.
Josh.
I'd like to follow up on this and say...
Use the microphone.
Microphone, please.
I'd like to follow up on that last question and ask if in your exchanges with these interlocutors you ever hear anything about the global nuclear detection architecture and the way that it is primarily oriented towards protecting the United States and not, let's say, creating a web of protection that covers everyone. For example, we're concerned with shipments of containers out of seaports that are coming to the United States, not going from any point to any other point. Does this ever arise, or is this just a free-floating perception that nuclear terrorism is an American
More
problem?
a free flow, but you're talking about the second line of defense program and megaports and all of those kinds of activities?
Right, and some of them are not specific to defending the United States, but some of them definitely have
But
that
even
flavor.
the term second line of defense has that flavor to it, which I haven't thought about it that way. No, I have not seen those references, but maybe that there are those perceptions, but I haven't seen them linked to that, but I think it's a very good point.
And right over here. This will be the last question, unfortunately.
Thank you. Sarah Williams from AAAS. My question is actually about your comment about the WMD free zone meeting in the Middle East that's scheduled. Some colleagues of mine were recently at a conference in Cairo at which their briefing back to us was that the perception among officials, in the region is that they have no confidence that that meeting is actually going to take place because of U.S. policy and Israel's influence. And I'm wondering if you have any comment on that. And then also the other interesting point that they brought back was that in the region, that meeting is very much linked with the 2012 ROK summit, which could certainly pose some problems with that meeting. And of course, these are perceptions of officials that were talking in corridors and none of this. But the impression of the group was that the meeting isn't going to take place, and if it doesn't, it will be because of the U.S. and Israel's influence. And I'm curious if you have any comment on that.
No, I think that this is the first I've heard that there are Middle East officials linking the Nuclear Weapons Free Zone Conference to participation in the Nuclear Security Conference in South Korea. I don't know whether that's posturing, bargaining, or whether that is a true felt sentiment. I do worry about it nonetheless, because even posturing can have very bad effects if you don't want to appear to have lost some credibility. On the first point that there's no confidence, I've heard similar things from individuals in the Middle East. And I think we have to be very careful. And I think about this the way I think about Article 6, which is the United States did not commit, because it can't commit to holding an international conference with all participants in it. We said that we would support that. Just like in Article 6, we didn't commit to reaching nuclear disarmament. We committed to working in good faith towards that goal. So what we have to be seen to be doing in both these cases is making efforts. And if others stonewall, or if there are disagreements about the format or something, we don't want it to be seen as being our fault because we gave up and showed a lack of commitment. And how that plays out in this case, or how it will play out in Article 6, I don't know. But I do worry that sometimes we think, oh, that's going to be hard to do, so we're not going to put the policy effort into it, when we should instead recognize that the policy effort in and itself, even if it fails to reach the goal, nonetheless is perceived by others as being a sign of our commitment.
I think we could go on for a long time, and I know that there are people who had their hands up, but unfortunately we have to end this meeting. Please join me in thanking Scott for a wonderful performance.